Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 Interconnection Process Enhancements Track 2 workshop to discuss the zonal approach and data accessibility today. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Jeff Billington, Director of Transmission Infrastructure Planning, Robert Sparks, Senior Manager of Regional Transmission South, and Dinesh Stressa, Manager of Regional Transmission North. And just a reminder, today's presentation and agenda should be posted on the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative webpage for you to reference at today's meeting. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Silas, could you move us to the next slide real quick?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. A few housekeeping reminders today. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These working groups, these workshops are intended to stimulate open dialogue. Today we're going to be more focused on a little bit of an educational discussion, but we do ask you keep your comments professional and respectful and try to refrain from repeating what has been said. Next slide, please. So there are a few ways to ask a question or make comments throughout today's meeting. There has been a minor change to the WebEx platform, but maybe a little bit different today than you're used to for connecting your audio. So if you're connected through the WebEx platform, it will automatically ask you to join through your computer. If you received the registration link today in your email, there should be a phone number just below that registration, that access link that includes the phone number and access code if you prefer or need to join from your phone through the WebEx platform. We usually historically have had that be the call me option, but the event producer will drop that phone number in the chat shortly. That way it's there for your access. So please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment today. And if you prefer, you can send your question or comment into the chat to all panelists and I'll read it aloud for you. If you do need technical assistance during today's meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer also. Next slide, please. So I'll hand it over to Bill or to Jeff here, and he'll be walking us through the rest of the presentation and different documents today. So Jeff, take it away.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to change in terms of sharing screens and bringing up the presentation for mine, because this is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to bring up a few other documents throughout the presentation as we go through it. So bear with me. This is the first time really trying to have presentation plus multiple other documents during the presentation. So. Okay, can you all see my screen now? And I'll just put it on.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. Yeah, and as appreciate in terms of Caitlin kicking off and introducing, as indicated, it's Jeff Billington, the Director of Transmission Infrastructure Planning here. I'll be presenting, and then as we go through questions and that, Vinay and Robert will be jumping in as well as needed for questions and discussion. And as kind of indicated, the intention is to kind of walk through again some of the material we have and what we've identified in the revised straw proposal as what we're proposing, and then just a little bit of a kind of how to use some of the data as we look at it for assessing the zones, and as what we'll talk about is kind of the sub-zones that are created by the constraints. So we'll go as we look at it, and as we talk about the zonal approach, it's kind of a central tenet as we look at the ISO's reform to the zonal approach, and the priorities, we try to seek available capacity, and in the zones where we're planning that capacity, and in the transmission planning process, seeking for recommendations for approval based upon the resource portfolios that the CPUC has provided for us. As we've stated, as we've looked at kind of the memorandum of understanding, and that to get the linkages and tighten the linkages between resource and transmission planning, as well as in the interconnection and procurement. And so along this approach, we do realize that providing open access to the information and connecting an available transmission capacity is a part of that, and that's what we're wanting to kind of walk through, and what we kind of proposed in the revised straw proposal. And I'm going to go through just a little bit, and as Caitlin also indicated, this is a bit of an educational, and some of it is just recapping some of the information that we've identified previously in the straw proposal and the zonal. And so as we look at the transmission planning and the zones in the 2022-2023 transmission planning process, we established the zones where the resource portfolios were identified in those zones, and these zones also line up with, when we look at the generator interconnection process, in each of the areas of the PG&E area, there's really the 4 zones, area interconnection reports for the cluster studies for the generators that are within those zones are identified. And that's a key component as we look at with the transmission planning zones, or in the generator interconnection identified as the interconnection area. They're consistent as we look at that, and then with the portfolios being mapped by the CPUC in their workbooks, or in their portfolio that is provided to us as a base or as a sensitivity, are mapped within those zones. So this is one of the kind of foundational, as we kind of set where is the areas that the generation in the portfolios are, the amounts where they're mapped to in these zones, and also, as we'll go through in terms of it's a foundation as we have in each of these areas, the constraints that we've identified that the CPUC also uses is by these interconnection areas as well. There is some overlap, and we'll talk about those later as we're going through it, but that's all part of as we look at these zones. And from the 2022-2023, we've moved into the 2023-2024 TPP with a similar type approach. As I indicated, the CPUC's, the information that's available, CPUC busbar maps, they have, and they identify the interconnection zone, the substation, the resource type, and the megawatts that really sets in each of those interconnection or transmission areas, as identified here, which of the areas, and those align with the areas from the previous slide, and then, like, say, which substation is it, and then what type is it, and then the total amount megawatt, but also the key is also, is it FCDS or EO in the portfolio itself. And then, as I indicated, these are the diagrams from the transmission planning process. They're in Chapter 3 of the transmission plan and Appendix F, and they indicate from the portfolio where is the resources that the CPUC has mapped to which bus, and a diagram for each of the areas we've got created and we updated in the 23-24 transmission planning process to include more of the area, the bulk system that is in the interconnection area itself, beyond just exactly where the substations were or the resources were connected. And then as one of the other inputs that we have is, and this is an important as we look at transmission capability, and then as we will get into what is the available capabilities, we created and have updated the white paper and workbook of transmission capability estimates, and that's available on our website on the transmission planning process and market participant portal pages. And the CPUC also utilizes this in the development of the portfolios in their integrated resource planning process, and they're using the constraint itself, and in particular, what is the megawatt that's capable behind the constraint, and then what is the incremental amount, and then what is, and these were developed in the phase 1 originally as the ADNU area deliverability network upgrade, identifying what the upgrade was, having a cost associated with the upgrade, and also providing a rough of how long will it take for the upgrade. So that's one of the other key pieces of information. And then as part of the constraints, we have diagrams for each of the constraints. These are included and used within the white paper on the transmission capability constraints, as well as they're included within when we have the annual transmission plan deliverability allocation report. So the TPD allocation report also uses a similar diagram, providing in terms of what was requested in the annual transmission development plan, and what was available and awarded, and what is available after the award or still available in that area or behind that constraint. So when we as we were looking at the straw proposal and some of the significant questions as we looked at it was the request for an annual report with all of the information and capabilities. And one of the problems with doing an annual report is the information comes available at different times, and trying to have an annual report ends up being becomes basically stale data, and so an annual doesn't work, like I say, as the data comes. And that's similar to the other request, was a request to make all of the information available 6 to 9 months prior to a cluster study. And again, as the stuff comes available, we basically provide updates. So the TPD allocation is a component, or the transmission capability estimates when we post them and provide them. And as we're going to get into, as we talk about things like the heat map, when it comes, the FERC order has specific dates for when, like 6 months after the cluster study, or 6 months after, or not 6 months, 1 month after the cluster study, and 1 month after the restudy. And so the information that won't put it 6 months before or any time. And the key is as the information becomes available, making it available, providing notification of when and where the information is available is critical, and something that we'll be working through as we're working on this and go through there. The other is a lot of the information that we have is in different reports. We have the white paper, as I showed the transmission capability workbook, the PowerPoint of what is the diagrams of the area constraints, the information that we have on the point of interconnections behind the constraints, the transmission development the TPD allocation report, the annual report that we have. And so we're looking to try to consolidate these into one. We're in the process of working on this and developing and putting the information. And this will just go through, and this is at a high level, and then I'll jump into the document, is wanting to get so that in one place for each of the individual areas, the information that can be accessed in a document. So we're looking to have what is the port for the, and this is the San Diego example, and I'll just bring this up right now. This is just one of examples, or one of the areas, but like I say, the document we're looking is to have the information for all areas. Is to have what is the current TPP portfolio, what is it by mix, and where is it located, and then having a link to the busbar mapping for the web page, which when you pull it up, and if you look at the tab by substation, this is the same as what I showed for the San Diego area. You can see here's all of the San Diego in the portfolio, the substation, the type, the megawatts, and they also have it broken down by their baseline, in development, and generic. But the total for the area that we're planning for is here with the FCDS for what we're making for deliverable within that area. And let me just finish a couple of slides here, and then we can take a couple of questions. The other is the interconnection. It's not quite as small as what's in here, but having so that in one place, what is for, say, the San Diego area, what are the constraints and the capability, and the diagrams for each of the constraints showing the area. The other is we're working on right now is we've got for each constraint or a table for the PG&E right now, and we're in the process of developing for all of the areas north and south the list in terms of the list of POIs that are behind each of the constraints. So I'll bring it up later and show you what I'm meaning here. The PG&E is currently posted for each POI that was studied, and when the ADNUs were developed, and the constraints for each constraint, which POIs are behind that constraint. So we can take some questions here. My problem is I can't see who's got the questions right now, but.
All right, well, we do have a couple questions in the chat. Let me start there. So the first one coming from CD McLean with the CEC, related to slide 6 on transmission capabilities estimates. Could CAISO comment directionally on how these estimates have evolved over time? Has transmission become more available or not, and why?
Well, the transmission constraints evolved. They were created originally, as we're looking at it, and as we look at ADNUs through the generator interconnection process. And in the phase 1 studies, the constraints were identified, the ADNUs were identified, and as we've gone through each phase 1 study, we've updated the transmission capability limits, white paper, and that's basically then available for the CPUC to use in their resource planning. So they've been updated effectively with each of the cluster phase 1 studies. This the latest being cluster 14 phase 1.
All right, and then we do have 3 hands raised. So let's start with Eddie Dadashti.
Eddie, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead. Eddie, your line is unmuted. You may have to check that your microphone on your computer is unmuted as well.
All right, maybe we'll come back to Eddie. Yeah, he lost connection. So let's go to Doug Carpa.
Apologies if this is something I should already know the answer to. The TPD is derived from the transmission planning portfolio, which of course has all the technology types listed. But once we get into the interconnection process, there's no limitation that says like if the CPUC has identified like a particular area needs a bunch of upgrades because they're planning on, say, siting a bunch of batteries there. There's no limitation that says that what actually gets interconnected there is limited to batteries to match what's in the TPP. It's just that's the total amount of capacity that would be in that area based on the transmission planning process. But we're going to end up losing that link back to the TPP. Am I understanding that right?
When we're working with the planning, we're planning based upon the portfolio and the mix, and those have different capabilities. The procurement, if it's procured and authorized by the CPUC and or the other LRAs in those areas have a different mix. Those will have to be as we go forward. Those will get caught in future cycles as to what is in development portfolios, and so there'll be a little bit of iteration from year to year as we go and the portfolios. But in those areas, based on the amount, it's not setting to say it has to be exactly. That's where it goes to the interconnection and the procurement in those areas and the procurement authorization of the resources, and then that'll get captured as to the mix being different potentially as we go in the CPUC's portfolios, capturing those differences in development.
Okay, so I mean, given that a lot of procurement's not authorized by the CPUC at all, it could actually turn out to be pretty different from what's in the TPP. Then sounds like.
Yeah, but that's what we're planning based upon there, and then as if different mix is developing, like I say, is in portfolios, the in development will adjust accordingly as to what has PPAs identified, because that's a part of the process as the CPUC is developing their portfolios. I don't know, Robert, if you want to add anything in there.
No, that sounds
okay. All right, thanks.
Okay, Shashank Bharat, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sushant.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, first, thanks a lot. Some of the information around constraint mapping that was posted recently has been great for PG&E. I also think some of the Southern California reports in phase 1 included this, and that's, I think, exactly the kind of information stakeholders need. I have a couple of follow-up questions on the capability estimates. A lot of it is centered around FCDS or deliverability, all the constraint maps or substations behind all the constraints. It's all centered around full deliverability. Is there any thought on revising or enhancing how the energy only capability is estimated? Because I believe with a large chunk of the portfolio being energy only, now that portion becomes quite critical, which in the past maybe it was not. I know a lot of the energy only estimates are either they are some sort of an estimate based on import curtailments or some very high level assumptions that can be accommodated on the system. I don't know if there's a plan to do a study based estimation of energy only capability.
Well, I guess one I can just highlight on what I've got here is, and this may be something, and put in comments, because it's not information we currently have, but how would we look forward? But there is the energy only or the off-peak deliverability and the constraint information that's also provided in the table itself. And so that's an area as to, and also in the TPP for the portfolios, we do conduct in terms of the off-peak analysis as well as the economic analysis for constraints based upon the portfolio, and that's something we can have a look at, or in the cluster studies themselves, we do identify where there is congestion management. Is there suggestions or alternatives or information additional that we could look at? That would be one component. And then again, I'd turn to Robert and Benet as if they have anything that they would add to that as well.
Yeah, this is Robert. We actually do run an off-peak deliverability study, and we identify the contingencies and overloaded facilities, the constraints, if you will, specifically in the off-peak deliverability study. And for the most part, they are hitting the same constraints as the on-peak, and so we leverage that. But sometimes they are different, and at least in the phase 1 reports, we do provide a different map and so forth for the off-peak.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was also wondering that there are a lot of these constraints where no limit is observed, right, in the studies, where there's that star footnote on a lot of, there's probably more than half of these constraints. And I was wondering if there's any thought of sending out a signal in terms of capability for those.
Well, yeah, there's a few reasons, and Neb, you could probably speak to that better than me even, but it could be that for that on-peak constraint, we did not see the off-peak being constrained because there was not enough renewables in the portfolio.
Right, and I mean, where I'm tying it is eventually these capability estimates are going to. Sorry, Robert, were you saying something?
I meant to the queue.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was.
Great.
Yeah, the follow-up was because the study amount allowed will be tied to the capability estimates for each zone. I think it's critical to get a lot more clarity on this. First, which is CAISO going to use FCDS study capability or energy only capability to decide that 1.5 times or X times that will be allowed or will be taken into the studies. And that's where I think firming up some of these numbers would be very critical, and we'll put that in our comments as well. I know there's no easy answer to that, but I did want to highlight that. And I did have a
appreciate that.
Thanks. My second question was around some of the information we had proposed in our presentation in November about without having to study what information is available around substations, feasibility of interconnections. I know some of the PTOs had comments and thoughts around it. I think PG&E was saying it was going to be very difficult. SE thought it could be done. Wasn't sure. I didn't see anything in the draft on that topic, so would like to hear from ISO or PTOs on that.
Yeah, I've got some later in the presentation that we can talk about that, and there was some information in the revised draft proposal, and I can highlight where that is when I get there.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, and just to add to your comment earlier as to the 150%, original as we're looking at it is it being based on the FCDS. Because I will say that is what the, unless something was to change, but that's what majority, if not all of the interconnection requests requesting is FCDS. So the intent was that 150 would be based upon the FCDS constraint and availability.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that. I think maybe we'll have some follow-up discussion on that. I just feel with a very more than half the portfolio being energy only, maybe we need to rethink that or have some sort of a discourse on that decision. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think that would partly also is are we getting interconnection requests into the cluster study that are for energy only, or is if they're seeking full FCDS, that's really then, or if majority, if not all, are seeking FCDS in the application for the cluster. I'm not sure how using the energy only for that 150 would be applicable, but put it in comments and we can give further thoughts to that.
And presumably 50% of that would only get FCD, would only get energy only anyway.
Right. Yeah. I mean, more than 50, and that's what, in general, anyone going into the queue goes in as FCDS, but a lot of projects know that not all of them are going to get it. So there may be some way to firm up the commercial interest around who really may be willing to go energy only in future if there is procurement interest. But yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, no, like I say, we appreciate the comment and put it in, and we'll have to give some further thoughts too. But if you have thoughts or kind of recommendations, also put those in.
Thanks.
All right, Jerry Melcher, go ahead.
Hello, this is Jerry Melcher, Public Advocate Office. Just a quick thing. On December the 5th, CAISO released a report labeled Briefing on Resources Available for Near-Term Interconnection. I don't know if everybody's knew that report was released. It's on the call, but anyway, could you comment on the importance of this report as it relates to the revised straw proposal and maybe what the impact is to the transmission interconnection zone?
Well, it probably relates more, I would say probably to the procurement side. As you're looking at where is there resources that in the queue have no network upgrades identified for them and identifying in terms of their status as well as to FCDS. And so it provides, or no network upgrades, and I believe we had with RAS identified. So it identifies the projects in the queue that didn't have network upgrades identified with them, or only have in terms of remedial action schemes as the network upgrade for them.
Was that targeted to report targeted to those proposed projects in the interconnection queue, like cluster 13 and earlier, that are identified in those locations and have not signed a interconnection agreement?
I'm not sure if like a lot of them will have an interconnection agreement. And in terms of targeting, this was an update. This I think is our third update of that essentially presentation that's posted on the Generator Interconnection webpage. And in terms of notice for everybody, it was noticed to all parties through our daily briefings. So it's basically information that's available for parties on the status of projects within the queue.
Okay, so it's not targeted specifically to a project that's already on the queue. Anybody could propose a project and maybe do an independent system project submission. And how's that work?
It's information on projects that are within our queue, indicating as to not requiring network upgrades or needing only a RAS for their the network upgrades that were identified. And so those projects are all on the queue. It's information, it's additional information that is provided for parties for basically on the projects that are within the queue.
Okay.
I believe it goes up to cluster 13. There's a cluster 14 phase 2 reports haven't been issued. Those will be issued at the end of January.
All right. So just trying to understand, how's that capacity relate to the transmission interconnection zone capacity that's inside the revised straw proposal? Is that first come, first served capacity?
Those for the ones in particular, those parties have had TBT allocated to them. So it's additional information, and you could link in terms of based upon the point of interconnection of each of those resources that is in the queue, and I'll get to some of the information as to how you can look at some of that, as to which zone or which area it's within. But those, particularly the ones that have identified as being FCDS, have TPD allocated to them already. And so they've got TPD, they're in an area, and they have effectively, like I said, no network upgrades or network upgrades only requiring remedial action scheme to be able to proceed. It's additional information that we're providing on projects in the queue.
Okay, so when you publish a transmission interconnection zone capacity availability chart, that's been proposed in a revised straw proposal, these previous projects that have the TPD allocation, are they counted against the available capacity, or are they part of the available capacity?
Against the available capacity, because they've already got TPD allocated to them.
Okay, so the capacity we would see in the reports going forward, once the revised draw proposal gets adopted, will be additional capacity in the capacity that's in the report that was this briefing on resource available report, near-term report.
Yeah, and I'll get to some of that in an example later on, and if you have questions, you can ask them kind of at that time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, so we do just have 2 more hands raised. Let's go to Pushkar Wagle.
Pushkar Wagle from Clean Resource Consultants. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, just 2 quick questions. Regarding this interconnection area constraints, what you're showing on this slide, the table, for example, you typically provide the existing capability of the existing transmission system plus the ADNU that can, you have identified that and how much it can accommodate in terms of FCDS and EO resources and associated costs. But we've seen that sometimes the CPUC portfolios or generation interconnection exceeds that capability and then the additional ADNU. So there is no incremental ADNU as such as identified. Now, I understand that your numbers are based on your latest cluster studies. In this particular case, it was cluster 14 phase 1. Do you have any thoughts about how to advise CPUC or even the interconnecting generators on regarding that element?
I just got to paraphrase back the question and then make sure I've got it correct. So you're looking in terms of, like, we provide as on here the TPD.
Yeah,
you and the cost.
The 1500 megawatt.
How much it increases, but what you're indicating is it's the CPUC is proposing more than what the capability is, but also more than what the incremental amount is.
Exactly. And we have seen that in some areas in the past, and even in the proposed portfolios.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, say that's because based on the information they're looking at from the resource, and then that available, or how much they're putting into that area, and then in our transmission planning, we'll end up having to assess that. I'm not sure in terms of we don't have additional information. We don't have an infinite number of saying if this and then if this one is increased, if you increase how much that ADNU has, what a next that would be a very daunting task to have for everyone. Is what is this ADNU, and then if you go above this amount, what would be the next ADNU?
Right.
We don't have that information, and that's part of it is based upon the portfolio, the CPUC looking at what they put in that portfolio. Then us assessing that as to being what we need to plan the transmission system. And if the amount is a lot more than that, it could change then what would be the ADNU that we would be looking at from what we were originally considering, but also the whole mix of it may change that. So I don't know in terms of how we could provide basically multiple ADNUs.
Yeah, because I think the concern here is that nothing is linear here, right? Everything, the transmission is pretty lumpy. So you, as you said, you might have to change the scope of that ADNU that you have identified to accommodate additional resources, or need to be another upgrade. So, and I think that's been a challenge, that we assume just a linear some dollars per kilowatt year number and try to add on and consider that in terms of the procurement. That's a problematic thing. I was just wondering that you've had in discussions with CPUC to address that issue.
I haven't. Robert, can you think of anything?
That question comes up in the weekly meetings with the CPUC from time to time. I think in the North Lugo area, we might have had that issue, if I recall, and so we provide whatever information we can, and usually the CPUC does not go beyond the upgrade amount that we specified, unless there's some extenuating circumstances, I suppose, some extra information we might have provided. So that does come up, but usually it's not an issue.
Okay. No, it's just that in the draft portfolios for 2034 and 2039, we are in the CPUC's dashboard, we are seeing quite a bit of transmission exceedances, and it has happened in the past. In the 23-24 portfolios that you're currently studying, clearly Nebiu, when he presented those earlier findings as part of the study plan, it had exceeded in several areas. It happens clearly more so in the sensitivity portfolios than in the base, but we've seen that happening. And in the draft portfolios for 2039, you see maybe about 6 to 10 different areas where that has happened. So anyway, I just wanted to put it on your radar and maybe have some sort of engagement with stakeholders so that we are informed in terms of what sort of advice or communication is between CAISO and CPUC on that front. The second question that I had, Jeff, was on the transmission cost estimates, and how do you sort of go about ensuring that those cost estimates are of the same vintage and they're comparable to a certain extent? Because some of those are cluster 14 phase 1, so presumably they're based on some per unit cost estimates. The latest information is used, but some probably aren't. I'm just wondering how those cost estimates are updated so that they are essentially comparable.
Yeah, like I said, is when we update the list based upon the next study that defines, and it has been, like I said, through the phase 1 studies, those would be based on the unit cost numbers there. That's probably where they would be updated, is like say from those cycles, and if they were to change, if the ADNU is the same ADNU as we're looking at the constraints as going through this. So you hit it, is like I say, they're based on the unit cost at the time when they were developed.
Okay, it's just that probably some of the cost estimates that I'd seen were from more sort of legacy one, and I was just wondering whether there's a sort of concerted effort to ensure that they're all updated, so that when these numbers go to the developers as well as the CPUC, they can systematically compare and contrast those numbers. So from what you're saying, there's some effort that's been done to make sure that they're of the same vintage in some respect.
Yeah, I believe so. And like I said, if you want to put that in comment, we can confirm.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jeff and Robert. That's all I have.
Yeah, I was just going to add a little more to on the exceedances, and that when the CPUC builds the portfolios, they do it obviously earlier than when we build our base cases, and there's I don't know, up to a 6-month difference or a gap in time. And so they assume a certain, well, they have information regarding which generators are under construction and under development that they put into the portfolio, but then 6 months later, that information changes, and the transmission owners, when they submit the base cases to the ISO, invariably include that more updated information. And a lot of times that becomes, you know, that makes the portfolio grow in effect. So I think that could be part of what you're seeing as well.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Robert. Thanks. That's all.
Okay, I think there was one question in the chat, and then there's a couple more on there. There's one question in terms of, where is it? With regards to does the CAISO publish remedial action schemes? The existing remedial action schemes in the transmission plan and transmission planning report, or the transmission plan and study plan, does list the existing with high level information for each. And then in the network upgrades, RAS are identified that would be proposed for the network upgrades. So those would be available in the cluster reports themselves, or ones that are moving forward are also included in the transmission development forum listing of network upgrades as well. So then we can jump back to the hands up in the queue.
All right. Eddie Dadasti, go ahead. Eddie, you're unmuted. We can't hear you. All right. You may be muted on your headset. We'll come back to you again if you want to put your question in the chat. I can read it aloud for you if you're having difficulty connecting. So let's go ahead and move to Alan Combs.
Alan Combs, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Alan.
Oh, great. So I will say that these constraints that got communicated, the constraints shown here have been very helpful to have those released. But did I hear you say they're based on the cluster 14 phase 1 results? Do I have that right?
Well, it identifies in terms of where the constraint is and where, and I'll get into in terms of where the POIs that they were studied, and establish really within those areas what we see for constraints. And as we go through the TPD allocation, you'll see the constraints themselves and what TPD can be allocated behind them is all part of that.
Right.
It's information that's available based on what has been studied and where the constraints are, and how much capability is behind those constraints.
Right, but the basis was the interconnection demand as revealed in cluster 14 or through cluster 14. Is that fair?
By where the locations of the resources in cluster 14 resulted in constraints.
Right.
And
I mean, the part I've never understood is that's demand is expressed to the queue, but then it's communicated to the PUC, which has its own portfolios. And I'm worried of one of two things. One, either sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the PUC will point to low-cost areas, but only want low-cost areas that are identified as expressed through cluster 14. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what the constraint is. That's one concern. But the second concern is that the PUC has a portfolio. I don't know where these constraints get redone to map the latest portfolio. Maybe that's what you can address, is how that would get updated. I mean, for example, if you look at page 3 of the slide deck you have today, you have the base and sensitivity portfolios for each area. And those base and sensitivity quantities are pretty different than what got expressed as interconnection requests through cluster 14. And I just don't understand how, I mean, there may be some constraints that aren't on page 11, so to speak, because the demand wasn't sufficient to hit the sensitivity portfolio that was, say, shown on page 3. So I'll leave it at that, but that's always been the disconnect is trying to understand how you take something that's expressed by the commercial queue and have it guide your, IRP process or what the PUC thinks are the best places for resources.
Well, it's identifying the constraints on if you put resources in specific locations. And the CPUC is using that in their resolve as they're looking at the economics of the resource and transmission that's needed for this. Is there areas that may not because we haven't studied? Yes, and those would get captured in either the TPP or in future interconnection if there's in those areas. But if we don't have resources in any study in certain areas, it won't identify what the capability is. And I think when I get to the heat map, that'll be something that basically for providing of additional information when we look at it and the information it provides for the generator in particular. But the CPUC is using these to basically identify if they put resources within these areas, they will trigger, if you go beyond the capability, it would trigger an upgrade that would be required that we would be needing to approve in the transmission planning process. If there's areas that they put resources into that didn't indicate an exceedance, that would result in the transmission plan identifying the need for an upgrade that hadn't been identified.
Understood.
Again,
all right, I'll just say that I'm not even sure that like when the PUC does bus bar mapping, there can be pretty significant mismatch between the bus bar mapping that they show and what's in the queue. And so I'm not even sure how much you can rely on some of these local areas, because even just the bus bar mapping could trigger different upgrades than what's shown here, because these were based on demand as expressed through the queue through cluster 14.
But when they're doing the resolve and the bus bar mapping, they're taking these constraints and where the portfolio is in relation to these. And then as Pushkar indicated, they do produce a table looking at in terms of where they identify exceedances of the constraints.
All right, so where is that table that shows the exceedances? I mean, not.
That would be in the CPUC's IRP process, and so I think a lot of the questions that you have would be back to the CPUC and how they utilize the constraints in their resolve modeling.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Let's go ahead and open up the line for Fernando Cornejo.
Very informative. Hi, good morning. Can you hear me? It's Fernando Cornejo with SE.
Yes.
Yep, can hear you.
All right. I'll just say thank you to the CAISO for your good efforts here in providing a good amount of information that will be very helpful in terms of trying to signal to resources where to interconnect or seek some capacity. But along those veins, I was just curious in terms of the good work that's happening in terms of trying to get information that's scattered and currently available, just not in one unified place, and the proposal to get it into some kind of a workbook or.
Oh, I think we lost you, Fernando.
Hey, Fernando, you might have muted yourself on your headset or on your computer microphone. We are not hearing any audio.
All right, maybe we'll come back to Fernando.
Yeah, and when I get into some other slides, he may join, and I think his comment will go a little bit more to the next slide, or the next slide when I jump into actually the document I've got. So, how many more questions do we have, and then we can.
So we have 2 more
those.
hands raised. Yeah, we have 2 more hands raised, and then I got Eddie's question in the chat, so I can read that aloud for him also. Maybe we'll start with Eddie's question in the chat. I know he's been trying to connect. So we asked, can CAISO make the load levels in each zone and subzone available?
The load level. I'll turn to Robert or Benet in terms of, I think that's in the base case itself for, as we're looking at them for the different studies. I'm not sure in the policy if we identify the load in the interconnection zone, but Robert or Benet?
Yeah, I can speak about the zones represent generation locations, and they're mapped to the generation locations. They're not mapped to all the load buses. It could be done, but it's not available, at least in the south.
Yeah, like I say, the base case have the information. So, sorry, Benny.
Oops, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that, you know, for the north area, PG&E area, the interconnection study area almost exactly matches the TPP planning area. So if you look at the base case and follow the zone numbers, should be able to extract that information fairly easily from the base cases posted.
All right. I do see Fernando reconnected, so let's try to reopen Fernando's line.
Hi, good morning. It's Fernando Cornell with SC. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you again.
Okay, I apologize. I'm having technical challenges, but in any event, kudos to the CAISO for this great presentation on readily available information regarding transmission capacity and constraints. Regarding the report that you're putting together, one of the earlier slides, you know, and recognize the challenges that a lot of this information is going to be coming from multiple interconnection studies or various studies, period. What the kind of conditions or caveats does the CAISO anticipate including as part of those reports, so that developers that are making decisions based on that single document or close to a single document have the latest information, and the information there isn't so stale dated that they arrive at probably an incorrect conclusion? Is there much of a concern in that arena, or not really?
Not really, because the intent is in these change based upon when the next available information comes. So the intent is, and that's why not wanting to say having an annual report, but having when we update the interconnection area constraints, updating this table plus the diagrams in what I'll show you in the next, basically the next slide really is what that document right now looks like, and then we can go from there.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. And I do have a second separate question, and this is related to the energy-only resources. Excuse me, it's factored into the question. I'm going to have energy-only impact, but the 25% cap at the parent level ownership as far as what can be sought from an interconnection request standpoint, and it's currently capped at 25% across the CAISO footprint on capacity. Presumably that'll be consistent with what I believe I heard you say, Bill, regarding the 150% threshold for the area-wide study would be based off of the FCDS. Is that also consistent with the 25% cap, or how do you factor in the energy-only resources that are out there as well in that situation? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what 25% means, and even a hypothetical example would be helpful.
Yeah, I think one, I'll turn to Bob Emmer, but I think that's more of a discussion that we'll probably be having tomorrow with regard to that. But Bob, I don't know if you have any comments. I think Bob is on as panelist. But I believe that's probably more of a question, I think, for tomorrow's discussion.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Bill.
All right. Let's go to Alexi Orkin.
I just had a really quick question in regards to the slide. Could you please confirm?
I can't hear you. You have to speak up.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you now.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for doing this workshop. This is very useful. I just had a really quick question. Could you please confirm that the TPD values identified for each constraint on this slides, that they're only estimates? Because they're somewhat relevant to which projects are allocated TPD, if it's project with high defects values or low defects values.
Yeah, no, I think that's the title of basically the white paper is transmission capability estimates, and as the column that's there is estimated FCES capability based on the study. So yeah, they're estimates, that's correct. And then the studies themselves are really what will establish the actual. So these are estimates to be used, like you've indicated.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. That's all I wanted to confirm. And sorry about the audio.
No worries.
And then our last hand raised is Jenny Mueller. Go ahead, Jenny.
I don't want to jump ahead, Jeff, because I know you're about to share some of the information that you plan on using. But on this slide, it talks about providing a list of POIs from studies that are behind each constraint. I assume that means, generators that have entered the queue, and we kind of know whether or not they're behind, certain constraints or not. And then we also have the information from the preliminary, bus bar mapping, and the latest one that's out there has around, let's call it 500 buses. Certainly less than the number of buses that exists on the CAISO system, and also the list of past projects is far less than the list of buses that are on the full CAISO system. So I know we want to build off of data that we already have. However, both of these sources don't seem to include a complete list of buses throughout the CAISO system. Will your list that you provide, I know somebody just mentioned previously a list of load buses as well. Is it going to include all of the buses, or just building off of these two sources?
It's built off the sources because that's the information that we have. And then if you're looking at other stations, there you have to do some judgment, or you'd have to look at going into the case itself to see. But this is based upon and what we have for the information. I think that's with this information. And then when we jump to the heat map information, we'll provide kind of a little bit of that bridge of what we've studied. And then when you get into the heat map, and I'll show you when you get there, when you look at the MISO, which is what we're building, you get more on what is, if you put it at different stations, different areas, based upon the base case that's being used and how it's being applied. At each station, you'll get, if you have, what is the defects and is there constraints, you want to align with these constraints or the actual individual overloads that occur. But these constraints are based upon where we've studied and we provided and so it's really effectively what's in the queue. Is kind of those points of interconnection where we had studied and the amounts. But that's the information that we have available for this. And if you're looking at stations outside of, example would be as if I have two POIs on the list, and the station is between it, you can assume that it's in the exact same. When it gets on the outside edges of, that's where you'd have to look at and see and really is really going into the base case to determine that. But like I say, the heat map information should eventually provide some additional complementary information as well.
And I suppose, Jeff, that kind of hits on my question is, when you open the queue, you are going to receive generators at POIs, not on the bus bar mapping list and not on a list of a generator that's applied in the past. So, at that point, is the plan that the ISO would test the defects of that unit using Terra to validate that it is indeed or is outside of the zones? Or will there be some analysis performed there before deciding whether they're in or out?
Yeah, we'll have to do that analysis similar when the projects come in, and as we're assessing the 150% based on capability, is if it's not at the POIs, where is it, and do some of the assessment as to find these constraints and available capacity or not. And that's the same as in terms of the developers, and with this information, and as I'll get a little bit more detailed in some of the examples. If it's outside there, then you're going to have to do that, and you do the same similar in the base case itself as we would do for an assessment when we're doing that as well. Okay. The same information and base cases are available.
Great.
To interconnection customers as well.
Okay. I guess my final comment question is on that bus bar mapping, and I've been reviewing that list, and I do, admittedly so, I don't follow enough to tell how they're determining what's behind constraints. But just by observation, buses like Hopland, which everybody knows is kind of up in that geyser system, lists 1,300 megawatts of capacity. Anything in Northern California in that area is behind the Delavan constraint. They've got a list at Kern Ridge of over 1,000 megawatts, which is off of the PG&E Midway system. Again, anybody looking in these areas knows that the Gates Arco Midway is a binding constraint for any project in out of that Midway pocket. And they show Newark having capacity, but that's behind the Bay Area ADNU. So I think there's some spot checking that needs to be done on that bus bar mapping, especially if, based on what you're saying, we're kind of building off of that. Just by observation, there seem to be some pretty, some things not matching up. So
they're taking from the point as to the geysers could be based upon technology, and as they're looking geothermal and where can they, and the amounts. But the amounts in the portfolio, when you look at the portfolio itself, are they triggering? The queue has more, like you indicated, and so in the volume of the queue, there's parties wanting to connect that basically has the constraint, and the ADNU would be required. The capacity that they're identifying in the portfolio, which is significantly less, especially the example like you had of the northern,
Hopland, yeah.
The total amount in the portfolio is considerably less than the amount, and so the amounts and volumes that they have may not be hitting up against the constraint, but the volumes in the queue are significantly beyond the constraint.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. So but a generator, I would assume, filing an interconnection in cluster 15 or beyond, that in that area, that it would show no capacity. But I suppose I have to see how the rest of this shakes out. But certainly any generator in the Northern California is behind Delavan, and that's always showing no capacity. The latest TPD assessment allocated 0 megawatts of eligible resources behind that constraint. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that a cluster 15 generator in that position would show 0. Am I thinking of this incorrectly?
Yeah, no, you're correct, and I think I do. I think we need to think about that, because that there is a point there that if in the queue the resource type isn't currently in the queue, but the portfolio is identifying an amount, how do we consider that, like the geothermal or something else that way? So yeah, no, I wouldn't mind if you wouldn't mind putting that in the comments. It's something we probably need to think about a bit.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Right, well, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, yeah, and then I'll just the last bit in terms of on this slide here before I jump is to, like I say, we have the TPD allocation reports, and Jenny made reference to that as well, and so do other parties. And then really when we look at these sub-constraints in the example, or these constraints and within the area itself, they really create subzones in the interconnection area and the capabilities. And some of them are nested, some of them are overlapping, and in a couple you'll see is they overlap because the electrical system is based by the laws of physics. There is some overlap between some of the interconnection areas for these constraints, and those are identified in the table I'll show when we talk about the maps that were discussed as to for the constraint, what POIs are behind that constraint. So I'm just gonna this just gives. Just gonna get it to exit out of here. And so what we're creating really is to look at one diagram or one document. This is a PDF document looking potentially as posting on the market participant portal. It has the information. So we have what is the portfolio, kind of at a high level, the zones. And then as we look at, and you can see each of the interconnection areas, having the same diagram in one place, the amount for the latest, and the link, which was a question in the chat as to where is the link for the bus bar mapping, so that you can have that. And then as we look at having in there one place that has the table for the constraints for the Greater Bay Area, north of Greater Bay Area. Also a link to the TPD allocation report, which I'll bring up in just a second here as we look at it. And then each of the diagrams so that they're with the table so that you can reference easier. And then as we also listed or indicated as well, the list of POIs that have been studied behind the constraints within the interconnection area. And I'll pull that up in a minute as well to look at that as well. But right now we have the PG&E posted. I have a document, it's in works right now, but I'll bring it up for example, that includes the southern area that we will be including as we go forward as well. And so with all the diagrams, like I said, and as you can look at, some of them have multiple pages. If we look at like the metro area and being able to go can you hear me again or still or no?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, no, one of my AirPods died because of how long, and so I just had to switch. So just making sure I got you could hear me again. Yeah. So as we look at the area, like I say, you can for all areas, and then like I say in the metro area, there's only 3 constraints. But having this in here, the links and the available information, just trying to put it in one place so that it's having to you can reference individual areas and the information. And then, like I said, the TPD allocation report is on the market participant portal and has, based upon the areas and the constraints, what was allocated. I'll just take an example. Let me see if I can get this so you can. So if you're looking in terms of in the South Magundan constraint, the area itself, and then the table that provides how much non-operational was prior in that cycle, what was eligible that's submitted in terms of affidavits for, and then the TPD that was allocated, and then the remaining TPD that was available after. And then in some cases you'll have where you have basically what was eligible, 0 is allocated because there was 0 remaining. So that's the TPD allocation report is out there as well. That's updated on an annual basis. So the update that this is from the 2023, the 2020 4 will be updated next year. So that's what we're looking at putting into that document and for information and providing the links. I have some other information that we'll talk about as we go through when we look at the examples. I'm just trying to get back to filtering mode. I don't know if there's any further follow-up, or I can continue in terms of for the discussion as we keep going forward here. Was there any? I thought I saw a comment in the chat. I maybe I'll address it if it was.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat from CD McLean with CEC that to the extent that the exercise is feasible, a listing of future expected and/or plausible POIs likely to become studied would also be beneficial.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of the future. That'll depend on IC submitting in terms of into the queue. So I'm not sure how we can speculate as to where. So.
All right, that's all that we have in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, and so just continuing, and this is like what we just talked about, the transmission capability limits and the available, to assess what is the available capacity is the capability estimate, the constraints, the available capacity, and the substation list that we have that was studied for behind the constraints is one of the sources, and these are all public sources like we've got in terms of what's published there. And then the queue itself, and I'll go through a bit with the queue and the public queue with some information that's been identified, and we have the POI status, or the project POI is identified in the queue listing, the megawatts of that POI, as well as what is the TPD status. And this is something that we added last year, and I'll go through. So this is the information really that's needed to be able to assess and determine behind the constraint, what is the TPD that's available, what is based upon what is the constraint and what has been allocated for TPD at those locations. And so that's the information that's needed to try to determine and calculate the available TPD. And I have an example as we go, and we can talk about it. And so again, I don't know if I need to bring this up, but then we look at it. The transmission capability workbook is one of the key components in there. But then as we look at the workbook on the list of constraints, and I'll just bring that up so people can see it and aware of, and I can identify what we're looking at. This is the current. If you can see it, I can probably kind of expand. It's a big table if you consider how many POIs there are. So if you look at this is like I say for the PG&E area, what we currently have posted, indicating what is the POI, and as we illustrated already, responded in Jamie Mueller's comment, is the other POIs that we've studied, and then these are the constraints for each of the ones that are in the table in that capability, and then the check mark here indicates is that POI behind the constraint. And so this is what's currently we're in the process of updating, so that we have for all, adding a little bit more to it, having for the southern substation list and the northern, these checks and everything else is the same as what's there, but identifying a little bit more as to the constraint, what area was the constraint identified in with the constraint itself and the POI. But also adding in here is if you look at for that POI, how many constraints is that behind? And the example I'll give when we look at it is we're kind of walk through that. And then also providing for this constraint, how many POIs are behind it. And so that's, again, as I'll is an important information as you're looking at or assessing as to when you look at TPD available, but how many are behind it, and if resources go at those locations, what the impacts are. So this is what we're moving to, and like I say, we'll end up with having for both the south and the north the exact same thing. I see I need to add the number of POIs behind constraint to this one as well. So that's the information that's we're looking at for those capabilities, and I'll walk through in a bit of an example how to use it when I get to that in the presentation here. Just gonna get myself back to where I am. Like I say, bear with me. This is the first time I've tried to do a presentation and bouncing between multiple documents in one of these stakeholder sessions. I see there's a couple of questions. Before I jump into the Q report, I don't know if we want to continue with taking a couple more questions.
Yeah, we do have one hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, Songju, you're right.
Yeah, Songju from Grapevine on behalf of Ted William. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, Jeff, thank you for the information. I have two quick questions. The first one is on that big spreadsheet you show the constraints and the POI. Then you check how many there. So if that constraint is expanded to include all constraints you identify in the study, or it's like for example in the CPUC spreadsheet where you show the estimated transmission, because you have some representative constraint, like you already group many overloads together, then call it some constraint, then you show one of them in that estimate spreadsheet. In this big spreadsheet, are you going to expand it to include all the flow gates?
No, we're not. We're basically not going through in terms of to add all POIs behind the constraint. Like in my conversation with Jenny, is this is where the POIs, where the generation was studied in the development of that constraint. If you're away from those ones, some engineering we'll have to do as we're looking at when you get to the specifics within the 150% where a generator is located. But from the point of do you need, from the judgment, like I said, is if you have two stations and there's an intermediate station between the two that are identified, that's pretty easy to tell that that would be within the area. If you get into the fringe in some of the areas outside of, you'd have to go into the base case to determine what is the impact associated with that. And I'll maybe just let Benay or Robert add if they have something that they want or can add to that as well.
Yeah, I understand that part. So
constraints and whether or not we would provide the list of buses behind all the constraints. Not necessarily all the buses behind the constraints, but I think the answer is yes. For all the constraints in the transmission capability estimates workbook, we would provide all the buses that were studied in, say, for example, cluster 14 phase 1.
Sorry, let me clarify. Okay. So that's on the rows, I mean the column. So for example, in your cluster 14 phase 1, maybe like for the Morro Bay constraint, you just show 160 kV overload, but actually behind that constraint, there may be tens of overloads. Are you going to expand that? Just show one overload or one flow gate per constraint, or are you going to include more under the same constraint name?
I think this has been it. I think I got it. So the short answer is no. The plan is to make the POI matrix constraint listed in the POI matrix consistent with the constraint listed in the transmission capability estimate. I see what you're saying. You know, some of the constraint actually has more flow gates behind it And in some cases, we expanded to few more flow gates to include because the single flow gate was not representative enough when we wanted to present the TPD associated with that ADNU or ADC. So, because of that reason, for some of the ADCs, we had expanded to include few more flow gates, but the short answer is we're not expanding to include all individual flow gates. So the constraint will be consistent between the metrics and the transmission capability workbook. Does that answer your question, Sanjay?
Okay, yeah. And the second question is, in that spreadsheet, I guess you use the past study results so that when you do that, when you check the POI on the constraint, it's a combination of defects and flow impact factor. Are you going to show, like, put some notes there if POI is behind the constraint because of the flow impact, not because of the defects? So actually, the size of the project matters.
Yes, we noticed that as as CPUC was implementing that information, we do plan to exclude the ones that are in the POI list because of the flow impact. Because like you said, that is driven by the size of the project, not necessarily defects. So in general, the plan is to include only the POIs that has 5% or greater defects, but not because of the flow impact.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay, I'll continue. And the Q report itself, like I say, as to information and public information. And last year in Q2, we included into the Q report information about the TPD allocation, where it indicates FCDS, PCDS with a percentage and the energy only projects. We also included in the Q the interconnection area where the Q project is located. The information that's in the Q, we're still working with, and in particular working with the Q report to make it more clear, especially on the FCDS, of which project has been allocated FCDS and where it's being requested. It's a little bit hard to tell when looking at the report for each of them. And then the other is in RIMS with the interconnection area. When we put this, it's got some old, and not all of them are filled in the areas. So we're in the process, but it requires, in terms of in RIMS, having to make some adjustments to the tables that are used to pick. And then so we're in the process of getting so that the RIMS report or the Q report, and I'll just show you in terms of with the Q report. Everybody's familiar with the entire Q report, but if we look at kind of the areas that oops, I'm zooming the wrong way. I didn't grab the right thing. Oops, wrong one. Oh, this is the one I want right here. If we're looking at what we added in the columns, you can see in terms of added where there's deliverability status. It used to basically had this column, but it's looking at where it is. Is it full? Is it energy only? Is it partial? But as we get to cluster 14, which hasn't finished, you still have where it says full capacity. So we're working through and working to clean up and make sure the FCDS status in it. So this will be information available as we're looking at how to determine. You have what is the point of interconnection in the queue, the megawatts that they've requested, the full capacity, or the status of it, and so being able to determine how much TPD has been allocated at those individual points of interconnection. And then in here, in the point of interconnection, like you said, is what utility and the point of interconnection, but also the study region, and these will be updated so as to reflect in that workbook or on the map that we have the interconnection areas that are currently in the generator interconnection but also in our transmission planning, so it's consistent and getting so that this is, and you can tell in the queue easily which interconnection area is within, matching those that we've got and in currently use in both transmission planning and generation interconnection, as well as which, what is the point of interconnection. There's also some that we're looking at with cleanup and point of interconnection, because you can end up with multiple for the same station. Example would be, does it have station in it or not? Does it have KV space between or not? And trying to get consistency for each individual point of interconnection, so it's clear. And if you want to try to do lookups or searches, it's consistent for each POI. So those are things that we're working with to try to make so that the queue itself, one, by adding these, but then getting these in terms of so that they're cleaned up and aligned with and easier to interpret for the TPD status. And so I've got some examples rather than jumping back and forth. We just a couple of examples, and we can kind of walk through as we look at them. I just picked 3 examples to try to, how do we get, and the one point in the example I think is a key for what we're looking at, and in the TPD allocated, I indicated behind each constraint you can calculate from the public as to looking at what is the transmission capability, but what the TPD that's allocated is looking at the queue report, looking at the individual constraint, and taking the POI that were identified in the study, is that links to the queue, and that's where I indicated as to needing to try to get the POI so it's consistent for every POI, that it's consistently labeled. Like I said, the example would be, is there a space between the 230 and KV, which then if you're doing a lookup and trying to calculate these, it's not really capable, and then cleaning up so it's clearer to be able to determine which projects, how much they have allocated, and FCDS or percent partial. But we were looking at originally saying in terms of case added information is publicly available, and we're in the process of going through, and time-wise is exact, is coming up for each of the constraints, is developing so that each one of you don't have to go through it and then questions of how and the information. We're in the process to try to develop what is the TPD behind each constraint based upon the POIs, because that's what's being studied, and what's in the queue has been allocated behind each of these constraints. So that's, we're targeting the end of January, just with some of the cleanup and having to do, just so that we make sure that we've got the correct values, and then like I said, how you go about that, like I say, is taking the point of interconnection list and the constraint, and on the queue then for those point of interconnections matching up to the queue project, how much has been allocated so that we can provide this information. And then this would provide in here, looking at is if you have the capability, how much has been allocated behind it. It's really just taking capability minus the allocated and coming up with how much. And then I'll walk through the rest of the example here as we go forward. But I picked 3 examples, and the first one being when you look at Weber. And so identifying one constraint, that comes from looking at, if I go to the constraint table, make sure I'm in PG&E, and I look up, there's 2 of them for the 330 kV project, identifying one constraint. And here, actually, I just need to add one more thing so that people, where did that go? Just bear with me 1 second. Just add something so it's easier. So if I'm looking at like I said, Weber, and then I add back in here the number of, so there was, Weber had one constraint. That constraint is below to Warnerville. And behind that constraint, there's 77 POIs that are identified. And so then when we look at, trying to look at in here, it's important just being able to know how many constraints the POI is, how much is available for TPD, and then also how many points of interconnection are behind that constraint that would be in the queue that, and as you look at it to impact as to what's available and also what is the competition for that available as well as you look at it. And so that's the example in terms of, like, say, if we take one constraint, I just took another one is the same thing. And I can walk through if you want the table, but it's doing the exact same thing. For Kern, PPP, it identified that there's 5 constraints that were in the table. These are the constraints that were identified. Oh, and the other step, like I say, is having to go to the constraint table for the various constraints. Weber should be north of Greater Bay, but it's taking off of this table what is the capability that was identified. That's where this number's coming from in the table, and that's where, like I say, from the public information, and that's where all of these come from for each of these constraints. And then looking and seeing as you look at it, there would for this POI to be able to achieve TPD, there'd have to be TPD available at all of the stations. And this is where you have some of them could be overlap, some are nested. This in particular, you have a small, so if you're looking at a 500 megawatt project at current PPP, you would have potentially issues as to here is the capability that it would be there, as well as there's 20 POIs behind that constraint. And then we just lastly is a larger one where you look at 9, the same thing, identifying which are the constraints that it's behind, what's the TPD capability, and then how much is being allocated in the same way, and then looking at how many projects or how many points of interconnections are behind that that's there. And then in this example here, you've got where there's only one, and basically at this POI. And so this POI is the only POI behind this constraint and the capability that limits it for what's there. And then if there's nothing in the PPP identifying at that, we're not looking in terms of that at putting in terms of a network or a transmission planning project approved unless the portfolio is identifying in those areas there's a requirement for generation that would trigger and require that upgrade. So that's really, like I say, is trying to work with in particular the table that has the POIs behind the constraint, the transmission capability limits, and then based on the queue, looking at behind each of these constraints based on the point of interconnection for the queue projects that have TPD allocated, how much of that has been allocated to determine how much is the available capability behind each of those constraints. And like I said, when we look at the area itself, these constraints effectively make subzones within the area that X amount can go into this area. But when we have them nested, like at this POI, can go into this and how much capability is or allocated or available. But when you have them as nested, or that if it's more than allocated behind these ones, it's nested that project can't get TPD because it has this constraint that is already being capable. And that's where, like I said, there's some nested, there's some overlap. And in the cases of some of the PG&E ones, there is some overlap of the areas. And I think actually I can show you how that is in here for the current PPP.
Real quick, I haven't heard from anyone, but just in case you need to zoom in the screen view, just above the window that's being shared, there should be a zoom option if you feel the need to zoom in.
Yeah, I apologize, and I can zoom in a little bit more. It's just I don't want to lose the data when you're looking at it. But this is where the current PPP. These are the constraints, like I said in that lit table that I had. But there's also, because these are just on the boundaries of Kern and Fresno, this POI is also behind these constraints that are there. So there's some overlap of the areas. So that's, I think, let me just go back to the presentation itself, and well, then I can get to some of the other things here. Just give me 1 second. Like I say, apologize with, or bear with me as we go through this. Yeah, so the next I was going to go through is the heat map, and we can, I'll maybe just leave it in this if this is fine for people being able to see it. Is there any questions? And then before we jump into the heat map on kind of how looking at a POI, you can use the information to look at once we provide the TPD that's being allocated, what constraints are there behind, and behind those constraints, how much is being allocated at there, and then looking at the size of the projects, basically with that available. But it needs to have where you would have capability at all of those to be able to get TPD allocated. So, and Robert and Vinay, I don't know, I'll just give you, if you have anything else that you want to add or complement to kind of the information there.
No?
All right. Well, we do have a couple questions. Let's start with Alexi. Oh, go ahead. Vinay, with that, did you have something to add?
Hi, Jeff. This is Alexi Orkin, AS Clean Energy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Quick question. If you go back to the constraints that you identified, the POI, that slide, my main question is, right now there's TPD available at each one of the constraints, but that no longer might be the case after the 2024 TPD allocation, because cluster 14 is huge, and a lot of these projects are going to be allocated TPD. So just because there's TPD available across this constraint now does not mean that it's going to be there for cluster 15. Is that correct, or am I missing something?
That'd be correct, and that's as we go through the cycle. This is based upon where we stand now, and then we'll need to go through in terms of what does get allocated in cluster 14 or in the 2024 TPD allocation. And you're right, that would update the information. And that's why when I'm saying in terms of trying to have an annual report as well is, so this is the current information. Once the TPD is allocated, then we'll end up with these numbers where there was available capacity and it got allocated, that would be in here. So that's you're correct as to for cluster 15, it will evolve as TPD is allocated in the 2024 TPD allocation process.
Okay, so maybe I can voice a concern that we have as a developer, because we have a group. So basically, we filed cluster 14 projects. So we need to like one of our teams needs to go and pursue the land, which is the company is going to be quite tested with the permitting process and so forth. So we qualify for cluster 15. But we need to have that information more or less now, since the priority zone. So the idea is, how do we identify, how do we find out if a current POI is in one of the priority zones or not, considering that these TPD values that you provide might no longer be relevant after the TPD cycle, because all the TPD that's there might be allocated to cluster 14 projects.
Yeah, well, that's in terms of, this is what's currently available as we go through the cycle. That TPD, and that's the normal process that's always been, is the cluster that's finishing its phase 2, then with potentially other projects in the queue, is seeking allocation of what is available for TPD. what you could look at is and that's why when you're looking at it is the information is all out there. It needs a little bit of cleanup, but the information in the queue has. When you look at cluster 14, what POIs are they behind, and are they in the areas that you would be seeking? Because they will be the ones seeking capacity. So if you're looking at the information once we provide in January, the TPD allocated, and you look at cluster 14, before we go through that allocation process, how many of those projects are in the areas and behind the constraints that you would be behind? How much is available? And you can get in terms of from there then is most of those that would be seeking in those locations. Is there more in the queue in those locations than what is available? And until such time as we get the actual affidavits and until we get the TPD allocation study done and the report out to indicate is there any available or not, that's the information that's available publicly to be able to determine in that area how much is in cluster 14 that's behind that constraint that would be likely seeking TPD. And so that's why I wanted to highlight the information so that you can do some of the analysis yourself. And we will be providing this, which then you can look at this amount. And if you look at the cluster and what area are you looking at behind, or what behind in the constraint?
Okay, but just
better, what competition will you have?
Thank you. But just to confirm, this information is not going to be available until after the TPD report's posted, which is expected to be in April or so forth. Is that correct?
Well, no, we're anticipating, if you look at what I said here, this is by January. So we'll be providing this by January. The Q report has point of interconnection in it. And so you may have to do a little bit until we get it cleaned up as to, like I say, when I pick when you take this right here, Firebird is, or Fiberboard is there. When you're trying to filter, does it have a space or not? And is it consistent, or how to ensure that you've got all of the ones in the queue in cluster 14 at that POI or behind that constraint, really, as to when you look at it, that could impact of these 38 projects behind this constraint. Where are they located, and is that in relation to yourselves, and how much competition from cluster 14 that are in phase 2, or cluster 14 per se, when they go into the TPD allocation of 2024, how much would you be expecting or capable after cluster 14? You should be able to get a feel from that, from looking at this information, the POIs that are behind that constraint, and within cluster 14, how many would be seeking potentially that available capacity.
Okay, but so sorry, just I don't want to hijack the meeting, but it's my understanding that the 2024 TPD allocation report's not going to be out in January. Is that correct? It's going to be out later.
No, that doesn't come out. That's I'd have to look to Bob as to what the current schedule is for that. But that's like I say, the information as it becomes available for the various study cycles. You can use the current information before that TPD allocation report comes out, like I said, to do your own analysis based upon what is available that we've identified, what are the POIs that are behind the constraint, and in cluster 14, how many projects are behind it, and how many projects in capacity that may potentially seek that available TPD, and because that's we can only make available what information is available at the times and throughout the cycle, and basically confirming what TPD has been allocated is a part of the process of the TPD allocation report. I can't speculate, but you can use some of the information to make some informed judgment or assessments for yourself based upon the public information and the available information that's there. Because, like I say, I can't anticipate how many projects in cluster 14 are going to seek behind TPD allocation.
Okay, thank you. We might file a couple of comments based on this information. Thank you.
No, appreciate it. If you have some additional comments, by all means, put them in the comment window, because appreciate in terms of if we need to think about some other things.
Okay, will do. Thanks.
All right, Shashank, you're up. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks. Yeah, this is super helpful. I had a question around if there is any information around timing that could be added to this framework, as you were showing some constraints and what's the available TPD. I'm guessing some of them are going to be contingent upon certain assumption of upgrades. And if there can be a field added to show that, okay, for this constraint, this TPD is available in 2027, or it is available right now, that would be extremely helpful as well. And yeah, wanted to check if that's feasible. What are your thoughts on that?
All right, I'll have to think about that one, and like I say, put that in your comment, because I think we're gonna have to think about that one a little bit. I can see where you're going with it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is super helpful, but we also developers would greatly benefit from knowing that, okay, some of these areas there's a lot available, but not until 2029, or especially now with some of the TPP upgrades and their timelines, tying back those timelines with these numbers would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, no, and like I say, I need to think about that. I know where you're coming from that point of view and the value. It's just how could we, and into where is it more something as we go forward? How can we incorporate, especially with the TPP now with some larger projects? And the intent in the transition, the TPD allocation, I'll get Robert to weigh in after that, but in the TPD allocation report, it's intending to identify because right now where we are for what the TPD available is in a lot of those areas may be zero. When we allocate, and we did with the 2023 TPD allocation, say for the Manning substation, identifying in terms of that the TPD that's allocated is reliant upon that project. We're looking to try to expand in the TPD to identify what upgrade when we do allocate TPD. And if there was none available the previous year, but we have a TPP project, it's relying upon it, making that more clear in the TPD allocation reports. But can look and see if you put that in comment, we can look at it and have some discussions internally as well, and then see if there's anything we can do in addition.
Sure. Thanks.
All right, we do have a couple questions in the chat. So the first one coming from Caitlin Leotis. Has CAISO thought about how the transition to the zonal approach with limited capacity in each zone will change the data sources that are relied upon in this process? For instance, by transitioning to the zonal approach, the information used for the transmission capability estimates may be more limited than it is today. Curious if CAISO has thought about that and whether any additional study work or new processes might be required in the future.
Yeah, that is one thing as we're moving to I wouldn't say just the zonal approach, but as we're moving to the single study approach and kind of what we were thinking of in IPE, but also in FERC Order 2023, moving to the single study and how we look at that, the transmission capability limits become in terms of may not be, because you're not stressing quite as much like in the phase one and then the phase one study before the phase two, as well as the CPUC is also looking at it as well, because they're recognizing that, and they've indicated, I mean, Jared Ferguson in one of the workshops, I think similar question, and they're working on how to look at that as well themselves from that point of view as to if the constraint information. But that is something we're having to look at and determine. But that's also as we take the transmission constraint and what we've got for the heat map information, complementing not to the constraint, but to information that's in a different manner for particularly for interconnection customers to be able to use as we look at the POI points. But also, like I said, rather than just what we studied, it allows that going to any POI, taking the base case that was there based upon the parameters. So it is something we'll have to consider. It's a good question.
All right, and then another question from Nathan Hightower. Are upgrades also included in this part of the TPP study cycle, and are they updated as you complete studies, or are they updated at a single point in time related to projects behind the constraints? I get that. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish the question. Sorry, I thought you were done with the question.
I get the TPD part with C14 currently, but is it updated as you finish or only updated at the end of the cycle? It seems like that could help allow projects to exit or continue based on availability and expedite the queue process.
Well, we update based upon, and they were done based upon what was the assumptions at the time of the study. There is some areas, and this is one. No, you have Robert and Renee, but again, as with the TPD that we've allocated, those aren't identified, or not TPD, the transmission projects recently approved aren't in those tables. As Jared, I think in the previous, we had discussions how they use those in the current portfolio and what constraints and what those recently approved projects that aren't in that capabilities estimate limit. We may need to give some consideration as to how do we incorporate some of that. One thing I have to remember is without study to determine exactly, it would have to be based upon judgment, and anything that we would do adding that because we don't have the studies on the specific constraints for what would be increased would be based upon likely some conservative judgment, and then having to move into the study cycles to in future include basically the TPD allocation will include those most recent approved projects. Then when we go into cluster 15, they will include them as well, and depending upon the timing, cluster 15 include any upgrades, say from the 23-24 TPP. And that's one of the things in the cycles that we want to try to get. Where are we doing the studies? And so we're ensuring that we have the most updated information going forward from that perspective.
All right, that's all I see for questions.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, that really gets on kind of the information that's, I would say, currently available. Work order 2023 requires the development of a heat map, as you guys are all aware. And along with the associated information, in the next slide, I've got what that information is. And that is to be provided 30 days really after the cluster study that the order applies to. So that would be, say, cluster 15 would be the assumption, and then 30 days after the study of the cluster. So based on FERC order, the development of the heat map is kind of for the cluster that you are applying it to, the order to, that's when you would start the heat map and the requirements of the order. We're working to try to provide the heat map, or basically the heat map, and what I've talked about before is that heat map will provide at the POI level an available capacity based upon the generation that was included in that cluster study or the restudy. And this just provides, when you're looking at it, what for quarter, an N-1 study and the transfer simulated and at each point of interconnection, and to be able to provide the information in terms of for each overload that's identified in there. And when I show you the MISO, the distribution factor, the megawatt impact based on the proposed side, and then as you go through the percentage and the power flow pre and post the analysis, the contingency, or pre or post the megawatts being added. And so what we're working on, and instead of it being available for cluster 15, we're in the process of developing a heat map and the associated information to provide it based on cluster 14, but we can't say that it'll be available 30 days after cluster 14. We're looking in terms of to get the information in terms of within Q2 for the development of that. And there's really two components. One is the development of the data, and two is the graphical interface. And so while we're striving to try to get the complete, to me, the key is we may not get the graphical interface component, but being able to get the data and the information in a means to do that. And we're utilizing, and so that it's to get the N-1, and we could use basically the current, and this is the tool that our deliverability methodology and approaches utilizes the Terra that they have in terms of the TRLIM, and they've got really the advanced, which is trying to look at the cluster approach, so it gets a little bit closer to the cluster analysis. And so using that, and which is part of our existing and our deliverability tool sets to develop the heat map from the base case from cluster 14. And then when you do the reassessment, doing an update of that as well. But beyond the TPD, or beyond the FERC order requirement of just the TPD or the mixed up there, beyond the cluster study and the restudy, what we're proposing also is when we do the TPD allocation, is also to develop the heat map. So when we post, we'd have to have what is the cluster, which would then get updated with what is the reassessment once the restudy or reassessment is done. But as a separate to that is also doing the heat map, and so there'd be two heat maps, one for cluster study, one for TPD study, and providing that as well. And thinking that's valuable information from the point of view of what has been allocated and what is available. But then when you look at the cluster, it gives you, similar to what I was looking at, how many are behind it, is how much is in the queue and at the different POIs, and then how much have we allocated and how much TPD is available in a similar format. And that is what we're looking at providing. And so that looking at once we get it set up after we're getting cluster 14, and then getting the for the TPD allocation similarly. And so the example of the heat map, I can quickly bring this up, but this is I think everybody may have themselves gone to look at it. But the heat map itself, looking at the zone, I can bring it up actually in there on the web page, and just an example clearly is what are you putting in for megawatts and picking what station. So if you look at MISO, this is a disclaimer as well, which would be similar. It's for information. The studies and detailed studies are more bullets there. Skip this. But if you're picking can everybody see this so that it's there? You're picking say a zone or an area. And then as you look at it as to in that zone, picking a substation. But if I want to put in terms, I'm just going to put 20 megawatts. And if I pick the substation, it will provide. And like I said, we'll work to try to get the graphical, but that's one is having to work with, but getting so that you can pull what megawatts, what area are you in, what POI, what is the POI, and picking one. But then this is the information basically at that POI. This gets to Sanjay's question a little bit of when you look at kind of behind it, there's multiple overloads. So the example is if I'm putting 20 megawatts here, there's 0 megawatts available because I have overloads at these branches in the base case. And so in terms of these are all constraints in there, and then you have in terms of what was the loading before, and you can see that it was overloaded in their cluster before you added this additional, and it pushed it to here, provides you what the defects is, and then when you can get 20, you get in terms of where you don't have a constraint and you're not resulting in the overload. So this will provide a lot more information based upon the cluster 14 then, and complement the information we have. And then, like you say, so we do it after the TPD. It doesn't have the whole queue. It only has the existing generation TPD that has been allocated previously, and what did we allocate in that cycle, in that base case, to be able to look at available capability as we go forward. So that's kind of for the heat map. I don't know if we have any questions at this point.
We do have a couple in the chat, and this might be from our last section, but from Aftab Alam, is CAISO able to provide any qualitative view now of areas that are expected to have some capacity and accept projects up to 150% of capacity for C15, or only accept option B projects for areas with no capacity expected?
I think when we get that information of the TPD that's being allocated, you'll be able to kind of determine that, and looking at what is at different POIs of interest where there is, and utilizing that information to make those assessments yourselves, which is be the same as the information that we'll be using to do the 150% analysis.
And then a question from Nathan Hightower. Will the map have any link to information for upgrades after phase 2 study?
What upgrades? Those will be in, those are all in the, if it's looking at the network upgrades, those will be in the cluster area reports. I'm not sure if there's, I'm maybe missing something from the question.
All right, Nathan, if you have a follow-up, you can drop it in the chat. We do have a hand raised, Songzu.
Hi, Songju, Bright again. Jeff, could you clarify or elaborate on this when you come up with the heat map at each POI, you say you will use the Kara Helium module. So basically, you will show like similar to a MISO, the pre and the post. Could you elaborate what is the setup for that pre? So what does the pre case represent? What's the like a general dispatch used in that pre?
Vinay, can I turn that over to you?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you, Vinay.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So for the purpose of this heat map data, the pre represents whatever the loading is in the base case, starting base case that we will use to create the heat map data. Post represents a certain amount of injection, not certain amount, the user selected megawatt injection at the location selected. How does that change the loading on the line? That is what the post means.
So my question is, what is that pre-case? Which case are you going to use? Are you going to provide that base case to the on your MPP? That pre-case is that same case for all the POIs, or it's the stress case from the deliverability?
So that's what Jeff touched on earlier, right? Based on the FERC order, the current requirement is for us to post the heat map based on the cluster study. So, obviously we will post the base case as we do today, so it'll be the same base case. But we do plan to do additional also after the TPD study, and that we believe will give more meaningful information rather than using the entire active queue, just the resources with the TPD. So those cases are already, the following the current process, we do post those base cases. When we publish the heat map data, we will identify which base case is behind that data.
Okay, so it is like, for example, in the TPD allocation study, you have a base case for Fresno area, and that Fresno area TPD allocation reflecting the latest allocation result will be the base case for you to do all the POI heat map in the Fresno area. Is that the correct understanding?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, we do have a question from Eddie Dadasti. Go ahead.
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Hello there.
Oh, okay, you can hear me. My question has to do with some of the equivalencing that gets done. And how do you guys plan to address, let's say, like Southern California Edison equivalences a lot of their 60 kV. How do you guys, conduct studies, without having specific network topology of those areas?
You want me to jump in, Jeff?
Yeah, I was just going to point it to Robert.
Yeah, well, the areas that are equivalent are not part of the ISO control grid, so we will not be doing those studies.
But you guys will also be doing deliverability studies for under WDAT, right?
It will be based on the point of interconnection to the ISO control grid. In terms of the heat map, which I'm assuming this is the context. So
yes.
So the WDAC customer would have to look at the interface between the transmission and the distribution when trying to use the ISO heat map. Now, SDE may be doing some things as well. I think they are. They could speak to what sort of heat map information they might be providing for their non-ISO controlled system, but we'll just be providing information for the ISO controlled buses.
Okay. Okay. I also have a comment. Thank you, Robert. And the comment has to do that you may find the substation without any constraints, but that doesn't mean that capacity is available at that substation. And that substation may be physically unexpandable. So there are other considerations that needs to be given besides just, availability of deliverability. That's it. Thank you.
I'll get into that in a comment, the comment that was, and what we're proposing in a couple slides here.
Okay.
All right, that's all we have for questions.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the heat map, and like I say, we're looking to get it advanced before the FERC schedule. Like I said, we'll get what we can in as much time as available before, and that's why to me getting the information that you can put in what substations and what area is it in, and this information of the constraint information. If it's going to take us longer to get the whole, we'll work at getting this first, and then the graphical coming later. And so this ties right into the question that was just asked, or the question for information on interconnection network at POIs. With the number of projects and in the queue, it's really not practical to be able to do for every POI what is the interconnection capability. When we do our cluster studies, the interconnection area reports from the cluster studies, they're publicly available on the market participant portal. The ISO provides a detailed cluster and the associated network upgrades that are identified in that cluster study. But the interconnection area report, which we refer to as Appendix A, which is individual for each interconnection, is only provided to the interconnection customer not in terms of made public. And that's where the information specific to network upgrades for that specific interconnection at the POI by that interconnection resource is identified. What we are proposing is to post, and this is for comment and seeking some additional information, is posting the individual cluster A reports. Other jurisdictions post them, the facilities reports, and that, but we're looking in terms of at those individual, but we would have to redact out any confidential information that's in those reports. And in particular, the Appendix GD in Section 3 is that won't identify the interconnection customer until the interconnection customer executes a GIA, and those are filed. And that's one of the things is once it's executed, GIA is executed at FERC, those are can be publicly retrieved. And it actually has a lot of the information in there on what the upgrades are, the cost, the timing in the LGIA when they're executed and public and filed at FERC. But in the individual reports that there, and so what we're looking is at minimum what was basically identified as is particularly the customer's name, but wanting to seek feedback as to is there any other information that the stakeholders feel as being should be redacted and confidential. And this would provide, and I can bring up in terms of, this is just a template of, I'll see if I can get this so you can see it better. This is the template of the cluster 14 phase 2 study report, the information. So in here where we say interconnection customer, the green doesn't highlight in terms of what we're identifying as being, this is just as a template of where things need to be updated. But things like the interconnection customer would have to be, the project name is on the queue and the queue number is there. When we get into the reports themselves, and in here, a lot of this is general, what is the interconnection area which is available. But then when this table, the customer would have to be blanked out. The project name is fine. This is in the queue. This is the queue. Technology is, a question that's there is the specific location of the generating facility confidential? But then a lot of this is then the same as what's in the, and like I say, the POI, point of interconnection, and what they've requested is on the queue report already. The in-service date was requested. And so what would be deemed confidential? Like I said, the interconnection customer name is based upon the tariff. Is this information of the specific exact location? This is all basically mostly in what is assumptions and in the study. This then gets into the ISD for the project based upon the longest lead times, can use. And so is some of this information as to the interconnection, PTO, interconnection facility cost summaries, the interconnection facilities. And then this gets in terms of what I think people are looking for is what is the upgrades that are required to interconnect, the cost and the estimated durations. I think I missed one thing. And then these get into, as everybody with what are the RNUs, but this gets, the RNU itself will be in the phase report. The only thing that would be is what is the cost allocation specific to that project for the network upgrades. That's not in the phase reports. And the ADNUs. I think the one other one that I missed in terms of, I just got to find it. And this is standard problem. We do provide the vicinity map that shows kind of where it is and how the facility located, like what the Latin long provides to here. Is that confidential? But this is likely the information that's wanted is what is the single line diagram. So what has to be done to interconnect that facility? Is it a rebuild of the breaker to a breaker configuration to a breaker and a half? Is it adding a breaker? Is it what was available? So that's really what we're looking at as we're going forward to be able to provide, but needing to ensure that we're redacting any information that would be deemed confidential to the project. And like I say, from the tariff, the name is, if there's anything else people have, that's where we're seeking comments to look at what potentially can be provided. And I can take it if there's any comments there. If not, I'll proceed in terms of with kind of the last component. And this is just, Caitlin, was there any questions, or are we good to keep going?
No questions.
Okay, and then there's a lot of questions and with regards to the non-CPUC jurisdictional kind of from the resource plans, and how do we incorporate so that we're looking at the CPUC portfolio and the mapping and the zones, and what we're going to be working with is going into the 24-25 TPP is within the next couple of weeks here, sending and requesting, similar to where we get the CPUC's portfolios as part of our transmission planning process. Those are based upon a commission decision, so an approved for what should be in memorandum of spending, seeking what is their current approved IRP or resource plans that they have, so that we can incorporate those. And so we'll be seeking to get that information, bringing it forward, bringing it into our stakeholder process in February for the study plan for the 2024-2025 TPP. And then we can have discussions based upon the information received, how we incorporate or coordinate those with the CPUC portfolio. Go forward. I will note that the CPUC portfolio takes, when it's doing it to develop it, the total ISO load, which includes the non-jurisdictional, and when they're doing the resource plan and mapping. So we'll have to see how does the non-jurisdictionals and based on what we get for their current approved plans, and how do we incorporate that with the CPUC portfolio. But we'll be doing that at the November stakeholder meeting, or not November, the February stakeholder meeting on the study plan for the 2024-2025, based upon the adopted portfolio, which is expected to be in of the CPUCs in February, and what we received from the request from the non-jurisdictionals. So that's, I think, really the last that I had for slides. We can see if there's any additional discussion. And if you don't have today, like I said, I look forward to any written comments that you have as we try to work to, one, provide the information and better provide and coordinate kind of with these linkages. So that's all I had, Caitlin. I'll turn it over and we can see if there's any further questions. And if not, like I said, we can follow up as we go with the written comments.
Okay. We do have a question from Songzi Zhu. Go ahead.
If maybe this will be discussed tomorrow, I just wonder, like at the end, I want to get an understanding how you are going to fill up that 150% of the zonal capacity. Could you describe the methodology?
I know it's in the slides for tomorrow, so I'd rather, maybe we can hold that till tomorrow, and that way I don't get cross-threaded with what's on the slides as we're describing them, and be able to answer questions.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, Eddie Dadashti.
Yes, I guess I have an idea or a question. I'm not sure which one it is, but is it possible for a resource to be connected to the CalISO grid and be not deliverable to the 3 utilities, but be deliverable to non-jurisdictional like SMUD, LADWP, and so on? Is it something that could be done to identify these resources? Thanks.
Just thinking. Robert, do you have a comment to that while I'm thinking about it in my head here?
Yeah. the most likely when the ISO has the greatest need for resources, our neighboring systems have the same, are seeing the same heat wave, and they're going to have the same need at the same time. And so dispatching that resource at that time causes constraints on the ISO system. Whether that power is being used by this neighboring system or the ISO, we're still going to see the same constraints. And I don't think there's a formal policy, but generally a neighboring system, they would not want to purchase a resource that's not deliverable on the ISO system and then count that resource as dependable capacity for serving their load, because we would have to curtail it if we're seeing constraints on the ISO system, and it wouldn't be any good for them.
Okay. Thanks, Robert. I understand.
All right. Maybe I'll give it a few more seconds if anybody has any last minute questions.
And I believe I didn't add in mine. Caitlin, I'll stop sharing. And did you add to the slide deck the comment date and that?
Yeah. So we'll go back to the main slide. Our event producer will pick that up. So I don't have the comment deadline in here, but we will have it posted in tomorrow's stakeholder call when we're discussing the revised draft proposal. We'll probably, usually we have the 2-week comment period. We'll probably extend that just to give some room for the holidays. So again, the information shared for today's meeting can be found on the initiative webpage. That link is there on the first bullet there. And if you have any questions, you can send an email to isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com, and I will help get those questions answered for you. As I mentioned, tomorrow we do have the full day stakeholder call on the revised draft proposal. So if you need to register for the meeting tomorrow, that can be found on the ISO calendar. You'll be able to join tomorrow's meeting. Next slide, please. And then real quick, just a quick plug for the Energy Matters blog. There is a new blog on enhancing resource adequacy, so I encourage you all to check that out and subscribe to the monthly blog summary. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, Jeff, for walking through all the material today, and we hope that you join us for tomorrow's meeting on the revised draft proposal. Have a good rest of your day.
That will conclude our conference. Thank you so much for using Inteller, and you may now disconnect.